Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 36 transfer plans. We'll talk about how my team performed in Game Week 35, where we just got a marginal green arrow, which sends us to the top 4,000 in the world. What my plans are going forwards, because I think I can say it now, my rank goal, given the position that I'm in right now, is probably to finish within the top 1,000 in the world. I think it's achievable, but we'll need a lot of luck. And then I think the biggest thing to talk about is, what kind of moves I can make to kind of separate myself against the field, as I have a pretty template team at this moment in time. In fact, most people who have a Wildcard 32 team have very similar teams, and they probably had teams that have outperformed me as well. People who have, let's say, had Hill over Gabriel over recent weeks have definitely benefited. But we'll talk about that too. And we'll talk about how I feel about certain teams and certain players, because I think this is the stage of the season where you're clearly seeing that teams are acting on different priorities. So, for example, European teams that are involved in semifinals this week have all massively rotated with differing results. We'll talk about, for example, Chelsea as well, of course, with my picks there. And we'll kind of walk through the actual transfer plans game week to game week in the segment later using the Fantasy Football Hub My Team Pick and Rating tool, which you can find in the link in the description below. So to start with, let's have a look at my team. It says 56 points, but we did actually end up on 60 points. This is sort of just due to bonus points to come in for the day. What I would say, though, is the team is strong, in my opinion. I think I don't have too many free transfers, so I'm sure I am similar to a lot of managers right now who find themselves in a position where they're trying to prioritize transfers. And yes, of course, people can say this is pure copium in terms of, me disrespecting sort of the Palace double game week, but I have no wish to really be invested in the Palace double game week. And we'll talk about that in a moment when we kind of review some of the fixtures for this week. But when I look at my team here, I think the kind of advantage, of course, is that I do have Gabriel bought in. People will be using at least one free transfer to do that, or they will have already done that this week, which is something that I've benefited from, I guess, in the sense that I own still Senesi going forwards, and I have Gabriel already in place. What is most likely going to be the case, though, is that Senesi could still be someone who is a cash cow to another Arsenal defender later down the line. In the midfield, sure, Palmer, I think, sticks out like a sore thumb, but to be honest, I think Tavernier is not very impressive, and neither is Semenyo. Enzo, yes, of course, plays for a horrendous Chelsea team, but I still think he actually looked very lively in the Nottingham Forest game. He was someone who still sent in a lot of good set pieces, and also at the same time, hit the post. So earlier on in the action, in the first half of the game versus Forest, João Pedro could have just got an assist from an Enzo chance that ended up at the post. So at least in open play, he looks relatively lively. Compare and contrast to, let's say, Cole Palmer, who, bar the missed penalty, didn't really do too much. I think he had maybe one or two shots on target within the game, but they were very much more pot shots compared to, let's say, Enzo's big chance within the game. And with Tavernier, I think, you have the problem now where he's not taking penalties, and it doesn't seem like the penalty share is mixed in the sense that it's a 50-50. I think it's more so almost like 90-10. And I think you could argue, of course, that the residual pen share that Tavernier really has is basically the minutes of play where Krupi isn't on the pitch. So that could arguably be maybe more so, let's say 80-20, I guess, if you were thinking about that, because Tavernier is also someone who doesn't finish full matches for Bournemouth. So it's not like he gets full on penalty share, I guess, technically, for the minutes, let's say, where Krupi won't play. So that's one thing. Struijk is kind of useless to me now. Same with Darlow. I think it'll be Verbruggen going forwards. If I just quickly share my team in terms of what it could look like next week without any transfers being made, the assumption, of course, is I play Semenyo at this moment in time. I probably bench Palmer. I play Van Heck for sure. Maybe even over João Pedro. I don't think that's a crazy idea, but it's still a very weak-looking team on paper. So the two free transfers that I have will definitely come in hand. But this is arguably one of the teams that I could play if I'm kind of anti-Chelsea. I suppose I could just play João Pedro as well, probably over Struijk, and I think I'm kind of happy with that as a setup. Let's just say that this is like the assumed team that I have. There's still a couple of gaps, right? So I think if I have two free transfers, clearly I can then bench João Pedro once again, and then also just maybe bench, let's say, someone like Tavernier. It's probably close, actually, between someone like João Pedro and Tavernier, now that I think Tavernier doesn't have great penalty share whatsoever. And Senesi is very, very good still at getting DEFCON. But I think the problem with this game week is prioritization. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But what I would say is just reviewing the fixtures for game week 35. you can kind of see that I think teams clearly have contrasting priorities. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you have something to play for, that your results are always going to be good. So, for example, West Ham versus Brentford, I think is not really a game that looked like a 3-0, if I'm honest. I think West Ham were a bit better than that. But at the same time, this is just to show the idea that I don't think we can just kind of run off narratives of, teams have something to fight for. So that's always going to be a certain result. And Forest is proof of that, with them literally sending out the B team versus Chelsea and getting a massive result there, and a very deserved result, to be honest. But Chelsea's attack still looked good, which is something to point out. Good in the context of, I guess, they played versus the Nottingham Forest B team and still, amassed, I guess, upwards of 2xG, but that includes the penalties. So maybe it's actually bad, and I'm kind of coping a little bit, but that's kind of my view on things. As far as Leeds versus Burnley, I think Leeds probably overperformed a touch in terms of attack. Okafor has been really hot. I think the Leeds run is kind of ends here, if I'm honest. I have no real interest in sort of playing my Leeds players too much going forwards. Tottenham also looked really good versus Aston Villa. But I think part of that is, once again, this sort of narrative piece of Aston Villa pretty much rocks up with, I would say, at least half of the B team, especially the back line. And they didn't really turn up, at least in the first 65 minutes of the game. And they pretty much give away that result to Spurs. So that is also sort of supported by Palace, who have done exactly the same thing. Palace did the usual thing, which is the same thing that they've done actually versus West Ham and I think Newcastle recently, where they play effectively the starting defense because they can't rotate too much, but they still rotated Riyad in. Glasner's now starting to rotate Munoz as well, and he's managed specifically the concept of load and needing to kind of manage that as they go through towards a European semifinal and kind of try to qualify towards the final here. And that's kind of, it just makes me think that there's no value really towards an a Crystal Palace team that will be against an Everton team that actually has a lot to fight for from a European position. Will probably rotate anyways because they're coming off of the final game that they have versus Shakhtar, and just haven't been performing well recently, or their mind clearly is not within the Premier League. So my view is I have no interest in Palace, and that's kind of that. As far as Wolves versus Sunderland, I think that was kind of just a game sort of ruined by the red card, but that's that. With Arsenal and Fulham, that's actually Arsenal's best attacking performance by a country mile, I think, for the last 2 months that I've seen Arsenal play football, which includes European football too. I think part of that is helped by Fulham having a really poor game as well, and Robinson having a bit of a stinker. Sessegnon is, I think, currently injured or suspended. I can't really remember. But yeah, Arsenal looked really good. Part of that is just Lewis Skelly and Calafiori is a lot more better as a front foot sort of team than compared to, let's say, Zubi Mendy, who obviously doesn't play on the left, but that's kind of the change in terms of the stylistic matchup on the left, and then Hincapié, for example, who's much worse, for example, in kind of like half spacey type positions compared to, let's say, Calafiori, who's a really prolific attacker. So I'm actually really interested now in Arsenal attack, and sometimes it's just something I think as simple as, I think someone that Jamie Carragher actually mentioned, which is just that when you actually have better players playing, they can just create something, right? So the idea of Saka pretty much breaking that entire game apart for Arsenal for the first 2 goals is just because of the quality difference of, let's say, Saka versus Madueke. And you don't really get those 2 goals. And I guess Arsenal don't look that good of a team if Saka doesn't play, in my opinion. So that's something to think about. But Saka is around and Gyökeres is around. And it seems like Havertz is now fit and ready to play for the Atleti game, or at least to be a part of it. Same with Odegaard. So that kind of dampens the appeal of Gyökeres, who had an exceptional game here in this Arsenal game where he got a brace versus Fulham and an assist for a very, very simple goal for Saka, which I think the Fulham defense sort of failed to collapse on. But to me, like, coming out of that game, I think, of course, people want to bolster their amount of Arsenal defense. But really, it's also the takeaway being that I think I'd love to have another chance at owning Bukayo Saka this season, and not Declan Rice, who, to be fair, at least did get DEFCON in this match as he got subbed off really early. For Bournemouth versus Crystal Palace, I think something to take away, not just from Crystal Palace looking poor, but actually it's just that Bournemouth have been an exceptional team as of late. If you look at their sort of recent run of games and the results, they've pretty much dominated their opposition very comfortably. Some of the wins have not been so easy. Some of the games have even been draws, like, for example, the 2-2 versus Leeds. But I think in all of those games, they comfortably had a very good net XGD sort of advantage over their opponents, and it just shows you that they look like very much a team that's like in form within the Premier League. If I switch over to, let's say, United versus Liverpool, I think that's kind of a game capitalized by a lot of individual mistakes, and Liverpool still not looking very, very good. So I don't think too much narratives can sort of be taken away from that. Bruno's still as consistent as ever. And that brings us to sort of thinking about like some of the macro picture things. I think, as I said, I don't have many interest in Leeds. With Brentford, I think their next game is Gameweek 37, so you don't really care about them up until then. But I have no interest really in spending or, let's say, using a transfer to get towards Igor Thiago in Gameweek 37. I think I'm just going to have to ride the rest of the season without him. With Brighton, this is something that was interesting because I think a lot of people, for example, the live stream chat was sort of questioning why I didn't want to play my Brighton players, or, why not consider playing a bit more Brighton because Newcastle are bad. I think simply this is sort of one of those kind of return to mean type of results, which is, a team like Newcastle, we probably see as being bad, but still, when a team like that is at home, they can still, for example, get a good result. And they have a baseline level of quality that is always there. So I think this is not too dissimilar, to be honest, to Chelsea, right? Chelsea's also a team that have dropped far off the mark this season, but part of the reason why we've backed them recently is because they have sort of good games on paper, at least more fixtures than other people, and sometimes you can still do well. So I kind of see that Newcastle and Brighton result as kind of something like that, and I wouldn't be too surprised if Chelsea got a decent result versus Tottenham in 2 weeks' time in Gameweek 37. But to me, the priority is to use as many free transfers as possible to get towards triple Arsenal, and maybe also consider this idea of, especially if we move over to the most important game of this game week, which is Everton versus Man City. So now this clearly changes the title race, and I don't care about the title race from the perspective of FPL. It's obviously very interesting for me just as a neutral fan. But I think the wider impact in FPL is you look at a game like this, City have to chase, City have to score, Semenyo still gets taken off, and Semenyo gets taken off so that they can basically operate with Bernardo Silva on the right wing. Something that's interesting, and sort of, I think this is another discussion point that kind of came on my stream chat, but it was just the idea of, why do I want to bench someone like Semenyo? I think the idea in FPL is where you have opportunities where you think that there are players who can kind of perform at a similar level. I think if you really do think that two players are very close, my at least approach to FPL is a little bit more risk averse. So I would tend to, not risk averse, but actually risk seeking, in the sense that if I think Semenyo has really high effective ownership and I think his minutes are not perfect, which means that in a game like Everton versus Man City, not the best of City's games, and clearly I think this was marked out and anyone could have seen this, but was going to be the toughest game that City had for the rest of the 4 games that they were going to have, including this week, right? After the Arsenal result. So from my perspective, it's just, I would not really want to play Semenyo unless I was certain that he was going to have perfect minutes. And we've already seen sort of grounds for Pep to not play him, like in the FA Cup, and to also sub him off pretty early. So I was pretty confident that I wanted to go against Semenyo this game week in my bench, which is why I ended up with a bench order of Enzo and then Semenyo and then Van Heck. But I think what screams out even more in this game is I probably could use another free transfer, even though I'm light on them, to go from Semenyo to someone else. I just think that if for the rest of the season Semenyo is going to have much worse minutes than Cherki, I see no reason to even have to consider too much about whether I make this move or not. If you've watched my What We've Learned videos, Cherki's baselines, actually, when you kind of look at his underlying stats, specifically even if you were to just focus on the City stats on a per 90 basis, are better than Semenyo's. He is much better at creating baseline bonus as well. So my perspective as an FPL manager is I do think that Semenyo to Cherki transfer is now worth it for me. The only reason why I didn't do it for this specific week in terms of game week 35, if we just flick over back to my team here, is because I just felt like that was a bit of an overkill type of move. Like I would have actually ended up benching João Pedro, which would have upset me even more, to be quite honest. Or even benching someone like Senesi, which is totally unneeded for a week where I think I already had almost too strong of a team on paper. Obviously it's, there are a couple of clangers and stinkers in here, but you can't really legislate for that, I think. So this is sort of how things have unfolded. Now, going back towards my team in Gaming 36, I certainly do want to make a transfer for Semenya to Turkey, but of course that just means that my team's worse for Gaming 36 in terms of all the other players. But I do think that the expected points gain that you make from making a move like Semenya to Turkey and Gaming 36 is something that you also need to factor in for. This is going to be a positive boost for Gaming 37, 38, because if Semenya, for example, continues to get subbed off at around this stage, and we already know that I think Pep sees Turkey almost as quite an essential player for this sort of run in. And even arguably Doku, for example, has much more importance in, let's say, his minutes for the rest of the season, then you can easily see Semenyo as being a good transfer out, because the benefit is also going to come in 37, 38, not just in terms of the marginal improvement of my team in Gaming 36. So that's kind of my view on things. And as I said, from the sort of wider perspective with Palace, I think the big takeaway in Gaming 35 is just the minutes on certain players, and I think just not really the lack of effort from Palace, which I think, to be fair, was quite apparent. But it's just what the manager is saying as well. It kind of tells you all you need to say. I mean, Glasner pretty much tells you everything. He even told us early in advance that Munoz would be subbed at halftime, and he's talked about how he still needs to manage load in and around these fixtures. Now, it helps, of course, that there's going to be a big gap between the European Conference League semifinal second leg and the European Conference League final. But if anything, that's kind of even more positive for, let's say, if you wanted to go triple Arsenal, because the final is going to be 3 days before. Sorry, Gaming 37 is going to be 3 days before the final. So if you're buying more into Arsenal players, you're going to be buying more into an advantage in Game Week 38, right? Where Arsenal will have an extremely easy game on paper versus Palace, in my view, especially if Palace are just going to roll out the B team and put their full focus on whatever the final matchup is going to be for themselves. So that's kind of how long I'm thinking, right? It's not just even for this game week where the priority is to go for Arsenal. It's also just, if you buy Crystal Palace assets, you're going to have to probably want to sell them anyways. And there's no guarantee that they're going to play great minutes here. Or even though, yes, of course, there's a Riyadh injury in the center back position, and it seems like all the center backs will have to play. Who cares? You know, a couple of defenders can get DEFCON, sure. But my transfers are too important for that. So no Palace for me, and that's kind of my view. I think people with much more free transfers, or let's say within the range of, I would say 4 to 5 is the only range where you really want to be thinking about Palace transfers. But unless you already have, let's say, triple Arsenal and triple City, then of course maybe you can go for it. But if you, let's say, have 3 to 4 3 transfers, let's say, I still think that those transfers are going to be much better served going in towards Arsenal, where you think they're going to put their best foot forward versus West Ham, and then they're just going to full send the game versus Burnley anyways, because that's, once again, not a game that's occupied or interrupted by any sort of European fixtures. And then, of course, if Arsenal get towards the final in the Champions League, which is pretty likely, I don't know what the results of the Atleti game, we'll see. But you know, you take your bet that Arsenal is going to put their best foot forward, right? Unlike, for example, a team like Palace, in many other cases. So just my last thought there. Right, so we're back with the Fantasy Football Hub My Team Pick and Rating tool, which is the tool that I use every week to kind of sort and navigate my transfers. But as I said, you can find that in the link in the description below. Key thing is, though, this week is something where I think it makes the most sense to work from the perspective of, if I do want to make that Semenyo to Turkey move, as I said, I don't think it's luxury. Now, the hub client clearly has the expected minutes for Turkey a little bit lower and Semenyo's minutes a little bit higher. But I think now that we've had back-to-back early subbings for Semenyo and I think 295 straight for Turkey, this is the kind of perspective where the model is clearly going to update that for that in the future. And I'd rather just make that move now. So Semenyo to Turkey to me is a lock. Now, I know Palmer's awful. But I think something to think about is, you know, for the course of the season and just in general, you know, my personal opinion, do I think Palmer is still a better asset from a fantasy perspective compared to Enzo? I think so. So I can do Enzo to Saka just like that. And I think that just might be the move that I do. I'm not sure necessarily if I'm going to back the double Chelsea players or rather just play the double Bournemouth players, because I think something that's really nice about playing the Bournemouth players is that they just look like an absolutely top team. Their underlying stats in terms of the rolling numbers, as I said, as a team look much better. Now, Tavernier doesn't seem that interesting to me to play, but I can certainly see myself doing something like playing João Pedro and then actually benching Palmer for Senesi. Kind of like the same way I did for this week, right? And I think, yes, of course, that's technically a loss in terms of how the model views that. But I might feel a little bit more confident about that because this is sort of just embracing the overall trend this season, which is that DEFCON is exceptional. And you kind of want to probably take on, I think, attackers where possible, especially since the game is quite mediocre. Now, I believe in this exact fixture last season, this is where Cole Palmer scored a penalty versus Allison. But let's not think about dark thoughts, and I'll just assume that this is probably going to be the team that I'm going to make and go with. What I like about these moves is it does use almost all the money that I have. So I think from a perspective of thinking about all the other kind of competing teams that I'm going against from a template perspective, I don't think anyone can kind of do this, right? So the idea of keeping Saka and Palmer is fun from a team value perspective, but I'm sure a lot of people can see this video and will just be like, this is worthless, right? Enzo's just better than Palmer, or none of them is better than what I have right now, right? Like, for example, like a Dominic Szoboszlai in the midfield is already better than these two picks. And you can probably say that, and I might marginally agree, but this is sort of the advantage that I still think I could have with Palmer, arguably, for game weeks 37 and 38 specifically, not so necessarily for game week 36. So this is the move that would use the most budget. The only problem I think with this move specifically is that I have no clean way of getting towards another Arsenal player in game week 37. So the next two games, I don't really necessarily see myself playing Senesi. But then in game week 36, or 37 rather, there's no way that I can get the triple Arsenal. And that's kind of a bit of a stumbling block for myself. So that's kind of why I'm a little bit, not so into this move. I think if I could so easily get to, let's say, Calafiori, I'd probably do it. Or if I had like an inkling that someone else could play, like from an Arsenal defense point of view, like maybe White could play and he's cheap enough. Maybe Mosquera can play and he's cheap enough. But I think we've already seen sort of White and Mosquera play within the league. I'm not sure if White, for example, will even play in that West Ham game. So it's hard to say. I don't think Timber will be back for Burnley. So maybe actually White is the pick that can kind of, I guess, deliver the goods for me. My only issue is if White is, let's say, available for game week 37 and maybe Timber's back for game week 38, does that already mean that I've kind of wasted my opportunity to own triple Arsenal defense for game week 38? So this, I feel like, is a little bit of a flimsy line in the sense that, yes, of course, it uses all my budget. But to be honest, I'm not sure if it gives me the best opportunity of maximizing on triple Arsenal. So that's one of the moves that I'm considering. And as I said, I'd kind of have to go from Senesi to White to be able to kind of enable what I want to do. To kind of refresh here, I think Semenyo to Turkey is kind of a move that, as I said, I do start off with in almost every case. I have an opportunity to maybe go Calvert-Lewin to let's say, maybe go for Gyökeres here. But I still have a concern with Gyökeres, which is that I think when you go for Gyökeres, Havertz being around the corner, or at least even being available, just means that I might prefer double Arsenal defense and Saka compared to, let's say, Gyökeres plus Saka plus Gabriel. So that's something that I'm kind of thinking about quite heavily if I was to make a Gyökeres move. But this is something that I absolutely can do. And so this would still give me Gyökeres versus Burnley, which I think is a great game. And here I think all I would be doing is just moving Palmer to Saka, which I think, to be honest, is something that I'm more than happy to do. I'm absolutely sick of Palmer anyways. So this is one move that I could do. And then in game week 38, you have the flexibility, I guess, to make whatever move you want. That's one path. And then the last path that I thought about is, once again, Semenyo to Turkey, and then just simply going Palmer to Saka. Because this is not too dissimilar to the first path, but the difference is I keep Enzo, which is going to be like sort of that whole concept of, okay, I keep at least one Chelsea midfielder for the Tottenham at home game. I don't see a massive difference between Enzo and Palmer for game week 37. And then actually the benefit, I suppose, of having Enzo over Palmer is that I can then just use one of my free transfers, like, for example, even going out of, I don't know, Pascal Struijk, for example, or vice versa, going out of Senesi into, let's say, someone like Saliba this week, with a lot of comfort. And then I think the advantage maybe is that in game week 38, I can have a huge sort of in the bank kind of surplus to make whatever move I make, which would be quite creative. So let's say that I go for Saliba here, assuming that I won't play Senesi for the rest of the season. The biggest thing here is, of course, this makes my team much better for game week 38. But then I also just have, enough money in the bank to kind of do whatever move I want to make. Most likely, this is just going to end up being, let's say, if I wanted to go from let's say, I don't know. Let's say if I wanted to even upgrade Enzo, I suppose in this position, I could arguably do it. I'm trying to struggling to find actually a midfielder that I like a lot, other than maybe Szoboszlai. But this could be it, right? Just simply going Enzo to Szoboszlai to end of the season is there. Gordon is also on the cards, as you can see. But I think Szoboszlai is probably the most interesting pick. In fact, even if I sorted, for example, Game Week 38 in order, the priority I think is definitely given towards, let's say, either Szoboszlai or just going for Virgil. So it could be a defender transfer as well. But that's probably the best way to kind of improve my team for Game Week 38. And that's kind of what I'm thinking that I'm going to do. So that's kind of where I'm at. This is the last line is the line that I'm most confident about. It doesn't really allow me to, I guess, change my team that much or kind of flex my budget. But sometimes in FPL, you kind of just have to sort of, I guess, acquiesce to what you think is probably the safest path. Because as I said, I feel like the first path allows me to use my budget a lot. It probably gives me an advantage in terms of if it is an advantage at all of owning Palmer over Enzo, but really hard to say that I think it's beneficial because I'm really struggling kind of to see what Palmer does. That's exceptional. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. Let me know what your thoughts are in terms of transfer pass. I am, as I said, working towards triple Arsenal Gaming 37. That's kind of my kind of guidebook. The fact that I can still do Semenyo to Turkey and still allow for that, I think is kind of what I think is great about the path that the pass, or at least that I'm looking at. I guess one thing to think about is if I take, let's say, that final option of maybe if I was to, let's say, just keep Semenyo, keep the faith with Semenyo, and then not go forwards towards Turkey. I suppose something that I could simply do is also just do, Palmer to Saka, which would save me enough money as well. And then actually maybe give me also the opportunity to move one of my defenders immediately into, let's say, Saliba, right? So let's say I do this set of moves, and then actually I've got a pretty strong team in this position as well. And then actually, I suppose for the rest of the season, yes, I have some menu over Turkey, but maybe having the flexibility, I guess, to go for, let's say, better City players or making that move in Game Week 37 or 38 could be preferred. I don't really like this because the way that I see it is I just think City with a double is a lot of points on the board. I don't see what's the point of ignoring it. Yes, I guess Semenyo is an extremely highly owned pick and it could backfire. I guess my wish to go towards Turkey, but I think the reality is Turkey is just a far superior pick, and to be honest, it's my fault for picking Semenyo in the wild card. So that's kind of my closing thoughts in terms of Game Week 36 and the transfer plans there. Would love to know what your thoughts are. Do you think I'm being a bit too aggressive on Arsenal? I guess maybe a bit too knee-jerky in terms of Semenyo to Turkey, which I think it's not even just the points that we've lost on the board to Turkey, but it's really just, as I said, the baselines are better for Turkey. So there's no real reason to kind of justify that Semenyo is a better pick than Turkey, and the minutes are just no longer there. So I think that that's the best move possible. But once again, you could flip it on its head and just say, Arsenal might be the team to go, to want to go to a 3x on as soon as possible, and maybe going towards Saliba and Saka could be better. But I think something to think about as well is, I'm not sure if Saliba necessarily has a massive ceiling. Yes, of course, he can just get a set piece goal or an assist, and he can do exactly what Senesi did, for example, versus Crystal Palace, with probably a much less chance of getting DEFCON versus West Ham, if we're being honest. But I think this is how I would rather prioritize stuff. And those are my closing thoughts. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.